Right then guys, it's PSL here, and in this video I'll be finishing off the first F1 season in the 21st century. So far this season it's been a tale of the battle between McLaren and Jordan. In reality though, it's Mercedes who are really winning from this. They supply both teams with engines, and it's fair to say that without Mercedes' superb engines, neither team would be as far ahead of every other as they are currently. Last time we saw Jean Alesi was leading the Drivers' Championship and Jacques Villeneuve wasn't too far behind. The Constructors' Championship was similarly tight at the top, with Jordan just about besting McLaren in this championship as well, albeit by only 4 points. Also, let's not forget that Johnny Herbert's unparalleled performances have put himself and Simtech far higher up the championship than anyone would expect, and it's largely down to him that Simtech have 2 points to their name. Williams, meanwhile, the almighty real-life 1996 and 1997 double championship winning team, still haven't scored any points so far this season as their downward spiral continues. So that is the season to date, and now it is on to the remaining 10 rounds, starting off with the Spanish Grand Prix at the Circuit de Catalunya. In qualifying, McLaren secured the front row with Jean Alesi in third and 4 tenths behind the two McLarens. Our two drivers sandwiched both Benetton drivers led by Manuel Collard, and finally, outside of the top 6, Johnny Herbert is the quickest and just ahead of Bouillon in the Williams, albeit by only 18 thousandths of a second. In fact, Bouillon beat his teammate by only 1,000th of a second. So that means 19 thousandths of a second, a microscopic span of time, separates 7th to 9th on the grid. Hideki Noda, the blatant second driver at Simtech, beat both Ferrari drivers, which is quite an achievement for him. In the race, both Benetton drivers pitted very early. Collard came in on lap 11 and Hakkinen on lap 14. Since our two drivers' first stint was twice as long as Collard's, it's no surprise that our drivers easily jumped both Benetton drivers at the end of the first pit phase. And it wasn't just us that gained places through the pits. Johnny Herbert came into the pits on lap 19, 5 laps later than Hakkinen, and consequently jumped him in exactly the same way as we did to take 5th. And that was the entire race. Literally, that is the only consequential moment from this otherwise entirely processional race. That was won by Jacques Villeneuve, and David Coulthard took 2nd. Following them, it's a Jordan 3-4, Johnny Herbert took 5th and so scored another 2 points in his Simtech, and Mika Hakkinen took the final points position, beating his teammate. The next driver, surprisingly, was Ralf Schumacher in the Williams, who finished 2 laps behind the Benettons and 3 behind the leaders. Next up is the race that marks the halfway point of the season, the Pacific Grand Prix at Ida. In qualifying, it was Benetton's turn to lock out the front row, with Collard in first and Hakkinen in second. Then it's an all-Sauber second row, with Damon Hill besting Michael Schumacher. Then you find both McLarens on the third row, led by Villeneuve, all before you get to one of the Jordans. It's Alesi in 7th and Berger in 9th, but separating them is Frank Lagorce in the 40. That's an amazing performance for him to get 8th, whilst driving for 40 in qualifying as well, which is a session all about raw speed. Johnny Herbert stalled his car at the start of the race and thus retired straight away. On lap 24, Collard came into the pits, and because of this Collard, he was one of the first to pit, so he was once again jumped, this time by his teammate who took the race lead just by staying out longer. Then Gerhard Berger came into the pits. That isn't interesting in of itself, but because Gerhard Berger was a lap behind his teammate and Jean Alesi was due to come into the pit 1 lap later than Berger, it means they tried to come in at the same time, and so Alesi retired because he couldn't stop, because Berger was in the pits and drivers don't double stack in this game. So Alesi then didn't stop because he already visited the pits, even if he didn't visit his pit box, so he just continued to pound round the circuit until he ran out of fuel and retired from 3rd place. Another unexpected retirement came about 25 laps later when Mika Häkkinen retired from the race lead. Then with just a handful of laps left to go, Gerhard Berger retired from the final points position, which means that Frank Lagorce was promoted into that final points place. The checkered flag came out to see Emmanuel Collard take the race winner Ida, with Michael Schumacher in second for Sauber, and Villeneuve stopped Sauber having 2 drivers on the podium as he took the final spot away from Damon Hill. David Coulthard took 5th, but amazingly, Frank Lagorce finished in 6th and scored a point for 40. That is amazing, and it's an accomplishment that I can barely even do when I manage 40 in the game. Yet Guido 40 has done it with Frank Lagorce behind the wheel. That is 40's first ever point in Formula 1. Not just in this series, but in 40's entire Formula 1 history. That's how big of a deal this 6th place is. Now, whilst I try and calm down from this truly amazing piece of history, I should say that Gerhard Berger brought this moment to the world through his own lack of skill as he spun off circuit, and that was why he retired. And finally, Mika Häkkinen also contributed to 40's first point by retiring from the race with an engine failure. That is now Häkkinen's 3rd Renault engine failure this season so far. Actually, a small correction there, because that is not Häkkinen's 3rd engine failure this season so far, but this season altogether, because it was announced after this Grand Prix that Mika Häkkinen was so badly injured after the Pacific Grand Prix that he will miss the rest of the season. That means that Marc Genet will take over his seat, much like he did for a brief period in 1997. In the Drivers' Championship, Häkkinen is currently 5th, but will inevitably slip down the order. Villeneuve, though, has opened up a fairly comfortable lead to be 9 points ahead of his teammate Coulthard, who is now in 2nd. Alesi is still very much in contention and only 12 points behind Villeneuve with half a season to go. Worryingly for us, Gerhard Berger is closer to Häkkinen in the championship than he is to his teammate or either McLaren driver. The Constructors' Championship doesn't hold too many surprises if you look at the Drivers' Championship standings. But lower down, look at this. Simtek have 4 points, 40 have 1, yet Williams and even Minardi have none. What I want to know is, what are the odds the bookies were offering on that particular outcome before the season started? Because it must have been at least 100 to 1. Surely even just Williams scoring no points would have been considered highly unlikely given their personnel and past form, even if their 2 race drivers are barely Formula 1 standard. Round 9, and strangely it's the Australian Grand Prix due to all of the shifting around of races, as this is the replacement for the French Grand Prix, which was the 9th round. But anyway, in qualifying for the Australian Grand Prix, Benetton locked out the front row with Marc Genet, the hastily drafted in replacement for the injured Mika Häkkinen, taking pole position. But then again, even when Genet last drove for Benetton, he was a fantastic qualifier, but his race pace wasn't the best, so we'll have to see if that is still the case 3 years on. McLaren took the 2nd row, Ferrari the 3rd, Johnny Herbert 7th on the grid, and just ahead of both Williams, who in turn beat us. So embarrassingly, we lost out to Williams, who have yet to score a point all season. But then again, Berger was even beaten by Irvine in a Minardi and only beat Hideki Noda in the other Simtek by 1600ths of a second. So really, we embarrassed ourselves in many ways. It's not just finishing behind Williams. Into the race now, and Kelvin Burt stalled his car on the starting grid. 16 laps later, Collard came into the pit, which was 3 laps earlier than Villeneuve, and once Villeneuve exited the pit, he found himself ahead of Collard. So even now, 1.5 seasons into Collard's F1 career, he's still making the same strategical mistake. Yet Genet, who has stepped in mid-season and took pole position, led the race, came in on the same lap as Villeneuve, which ensured he would keep the race lead. So Genet is not only quicker than Collard, but also has better race strategies. Come lap 51, Gerhard Berger retired from only 8th place, but he was beating his teammate at the time, to be fair to him. That was it for the Australian Grand Prix, which saw Marc Genet, Benetton's test driver, win and beat the championship leader of Jacques Villeneuve, albeit by only 1.5 seconds come the end. Collard took 3rd, Coulthard 4th, Barrichello 5th and Katayama 6th, and that meant it was a double point scoring race for Ferrari. Alesi came home in 9th behind Herbert and Bouillon, but at least we had a better race than Sauber, who had Damon Hill finishing 11th and Michael Schumacher all the way down in 13th, and that's an improvement on where they qualified embarrassingly. One final note is that Gerhard Berger spun off, and that's why he retired. It's the second race in a row in which Berger has retired by spinning off circuit, so effectively the second race in a row in which Gerhard Berger has retired through a driver mistake. Marc Genet's race win was so impressive that he simultaneously made the headline story on both page 7, where they claimed his race win was dominant, which is arguable, and page 8, which points out that this was Genet's first race win ever in Formula 1. Round 10, my home race, and the race that's in Jordan's back garden. And it wasn't a British driver who took pole position, as it was Marc Genet for the second race in a row who took the top spot for Benetton. Coulthard took 2nd at his home race, Villeneuve 3rd, Collard 4th, and Sauber in 5th and 6th, the team having improved massively from the previous round, with Damon Hill getting the better of Michael Schumacher. Jordan were the 4th quickest team, and Johnny Herbert took 9th on the starting grid for his home race. Just after we hit double figure laps in the race, Hill and Coulthard pitted and ended up losing places in the long run by coming in so early. In fact, they came in so early that even Emmanuel Collard didn't pit until 5 laps after Hill did. The final pit phase ended with Jean Alesi moving up to 4th just by pitting later. Berger by this point jumped DC and Hill, but not quite Collard. But just a few laps after Berger exited the pits for the final time, both he and Emmanuel Collard retired from the Grand Prix. That promoted Coulthard and Hill back into a points place, with Herbert just outside the top 6 for his home race. Marc Genet won the British Grand Prix. That's his second ever F1 race win, as well as his second one in a row. There's one McLaren driver on the podium along with one Sauber driver as well. Basically, the podium was made up of the drivers that didn't make any mistakes from each of the 3 quickest teams here. Hence why DC and Hill weren't on the podium as they pitted early, and the same could be said for Collard, who pitted early and retired from the race due to spinning off. Gerhard Berger also spun out on the very same lap as Collard, meaning it was just one Jordan driver that scored points as Jean Alesi moved up the grid over the course of the race to take 4th. A quick look at the Drivers' Championship with 10 rounds down and 6 to go shows us that Villeneuve has built up a commanding championship lead. He now has 60 points, which is 16 more than his teammate and 21 more than Jordan's best driver. But the main reason I've brought it up now is to look at the drivers in 5th, 6th and 7th. Marc Genet has only done 2 races and yet has already scored more points than the driver he replaced, Mika Häkkinen, and Mika Häkkinen did 4 times as many races. It's not really a fair comparison though, because Genet just so happens to have come in just as Benetton have found another shot of speed. And let's not forget that Häkkinen was leading the 8th race before his engine blew up and injured him. Also, Häkkinen had 3 engine failures that cost him a whole heap of points, something which hasn't happened to Genet yet. Benetton's boost of pace and Genet's masterful driving and strategies have put Benetton only 3 points behind Jordan. So now not only are Jordan's chances of winning a championship this season slipping, but also the chances of finishing as a runner-up. Just before I head into the German Grand Prix at the mother of all power circuits, I think I should go through the specifics of the engines this season. So ourselves and McLaren have undoubtedly the best engine, as the Mercedes engine is the most powerful and lightest engine on the grid. The Renault engine used by Benetton has 5 less horsepower and weighs 12 kilograms more, and is where Benetton's lack of pace comes from. If they had the Mercedes engine, I think they would still be winning championships. But then again, their pace over the past 3 races has been unbeatable, even with their engine handicap. Ferrari's engine has even less power and a lot more weight. In fact, it is 12 kilograms heavier than the Ford engine used by Williams, Sauber and Simtek. And that Ford engine was improved heading into this season, meaning it produces the same power as the Ferrari engine. And that explains why Ferrari have gotten worse over the course of this career mode, because they've never improved upon their engine. It also shows how Simtek have rocketed up the field this season to be a midfielder, because the engine they're running is such a big improvement on what they had before. The engine they had previously, I believe, is the same one that Pacific are still running, and look, it only has 640 horsepower. That's 60 less than the best one Ford can offer, and it's even 30 less than the one used by 40. So Pacific have really been screwed over on the engine department, because Ford are producing much better engines for every single other team that they supply. Although I can't help but feel that the Jordan team have also been screwed over in terms of engines, because looking at the qualifying for the German Grand Prix, Benetton and McLaren took the front 2 rows, and then it's the 2 Jordans in 5th and 6th, about 3 seconds a lap off the pace set by the McLarens. How can we be so far off the pace when we have the same engines, and as we saw a few rounds back, our car has no inferior parts when compared to the McLaren? So why are we so slow? It's one of the great mysteries of this game that I will never understand, and why I can't win with a backmarker team, because you can be slower than you should be on paper with no way to improve and no explainable reason as to why you're so slow. Anyway, behind us it's Ferrari, who beats the Ford Zetec R runners despite their heavier engine. Also, just to clear up that both Sauber and Minardi are missing from this race. It is unexplainable as to why, but for some reason on this game, teams do miss this race, so it's not a surprise that, well, on this case, Sauber and Minardi haven't turned up. Off the starting grid, Gerhard Berger made up 2 places, one on Alesi and the other on Coulthard. With only 6 and a bit laps done, Gerhard Berger was somehow 30 seconds off of the race leader, and even 28 seconds behind Collard, who was just 1 place ahead of him. On lap 21, with the rain pouring down, both of our drivers retired. That's because they were still out there on dry tyres, and I did that because their scheduled pit stops were just around the corner, and if we met them, we could do a 1-stop race. But in the end, we didn't undertake any strategy. On lap 28, well, he was on lap 28 at least, Ralf Schumacher received a 10-second stop-go penalty, which dropped him behind Kelvin Burt in the 40. That promoted Burt into 7th, which then became 6th when David Coulthard retired from 4th place. And come the end of the German Grand Prix, Marc Genet won his 3rd F1 race in a row. There's the famous F1 quote from Mark Webber, "Not bad for a number 2 driver." Well, Genet hasn't done all that badly for just a mere test driver. Here he beat Villeneuve, who had the engine advantage, as well as both Ferraris. But the main story, as far as I'm concerned, is Kelvin Burt's 6th place finish and thus 42nd point in this Formula 1 season, as well as their 2nd point ever. That's the 2nd time now that a Gerhard Berger retirement has helped them to finish 6th. And it also means that both of 40's drivers, Frank Lagorce and Kelvin Burt, have scored a point this season. After he missed one of his 2 home Grand Prix, Michael Schumacher won't take part in the next race as well because he's unwell. So that means Pedro Lamy will step in and attempt to fill Michael Schumacher's shoes. The next race is the Canadian Grand Prix at the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve, and Gilles' son Jacques didn't take pole position because Emmanuel Collard did. In fact, Jacques wasn't even the fastest McLaren driver, as David Coulthard beat him to take 3rd. Williams amazingly wound up as the third quickest team here, a result that came from absolutely nowhere. Johnny Herbert beat us in his Simtech as Alesi finished in 8th and Berger in 9th. So much for us having the best engines on the grid because, as I've already said, I have no idea why we're so far off the pace of McLaren because on paper there's no reason why we should be. Anyway, Pedro Lamy was the next driver after ours, and that means that Lamy beat Damon Hill. And let's not forget that Lamy is only the team's test driver and has come in for this race only, yet he still outqualified the real-life 1996 champion by 0.4 of a second. Into the race now, and Marc Genet had a shocking start, losing 3 positions and even dropping behind Jean-Christophe Bouillon in the Williams. Later you get to the first pit phase, and this brought about a couple of changes. Firstly, Collard pitted as early as he always does, and Alesi came in about 8 laps later. Well, Collard's early stop cost him the race lead, yet Alesi's late stop allowed him to gain a couple of places to move up into the final points place. Things got worse for Benetton because on lap 52, Marc Genet retired, promoting Ralf Schumacher up into a points position. Jacques Villeneuve won his home Grand Prix and was 26 seconds ahead of Collard in the Benetton, who took second. Coulthard took the final podium spot with Bouillon in 4th, Alesi in 5th and Ralf Schumacher in 6th, and Berger just missed out on a point in 7th. Importantly though, this sudden boost in performance for Williams allowed them to score their first points all season. They did it comfortably as well, besting the Jordan team and getting both of their drivers inside the top 6. Also, just to say that Marc Genet, who had done well to avoid Renault's reliability issues, finally succumbed to them as he retired due to an engine issue. You can also see there that Bertrand Gachot for Pacific retired due to him spinning off. That's not all that interesting by itself, but it must have been a nasty accident because he too will miss the rest of the season because of it. So that means that for the rest of the season, we'll have the Brit of Oliver Gavin on the field and taking his place for the rest of the season. In between the Canadian and Belgian GPs, I went back to Enstone again and took Benetton's steering system, which was better than ours, but well, now it is ours. At the end of the qualifying session for the Belgian Grand Prix, strangely Ferrari were the quickest and took the front row, and specifically Barrichello took pole position. Sauber were the second quickest team with Damon Hill beating Michael Schumacher, who is back after recovering from his illness. Next is Genet, Villeneuve, Collard and Coulthard, and then even both Minardis came before both Jordans, with Irvine beating Fisichella by 0.2 of a second. Also, just as a quick side note, Oliver Gavin, the replacement for Bertrand Gachot, qualified in last but was only 0.4 of a second behind his teammate, which is impressive for a hastily drafted in rookie. At the very start of the race, going around La Source, Villeneuve overtook Damon Hill for 4th place. On the turn of lap 12, Collard, Coulthard, Hill and Barrichello all pitted, and Alesi was able to jump 2 of them just by coming in 2 laps later. Come lap 30 or so, everyone pits due to the drying track, and through the chaos Michael Schumacher ended up taking the race lead. He then pitted to give Villeneuve the race lead, who then himself pitted to give the lead to Damon Hill, and then even Damon Hill pitted to give the race lead back to Michael Schumacher, who ended up taking his Sauber all the way to the checkered flag in 1st place. Just to rewind a bit though, both Jordan drivers retired whilst that was going on because they were out on dry tyres when it was raining. Honestly, that was a mistake on my part as I was making notes for this video at the time and I wasn't really paying attention to the game, but to be fair, if you added another pit stop, we would have been unlikely to score many, if any, points. Anyway, back to the main story, and that is Michael Schumacher's race win around Spa whilst driving in a Sauber. Katayama took 2nd in his tricky changeable conditions race, and Damon Hill took 3rd to make it a double podium finish for Sauber. Villeneuve, Genet and Coulthard rounded up the final points positions. And that is pretty much it. So in the Drivers' Championship, with just 3 races to go, Jacques Villeneuve is 30 points ahead of Coulthard. So, without getting into the business of race wins, Villeneuve has basically won the 2000 Drivers' Championship. Alesi is caught up to Coulthard in the championship, and Genet is now the highest scoring Benetton driver. And even Michael Schumacher has outscored Mika Hakkinen now. In the Constructors' Championship, not all that much has changed, other than Benetton have passed and pulled away from Jordan, Sauber have extended their lead over Ferrari for 4th, and Williams have finally got their act together to pass 40 and be tied on points with Simtek in the Constructors' Championship. Round 14, the Italian Grand Prix, and it's clear here that the Mercedes engines are the ones to have, as McLaren took the front row and even Jordan the second row. That's the first time in a while that Jordan have been towards the front, because over the past few races we've been slipping down the order. Behind us it's both Benettons, then Damon Hill, Johnny Herbert, Michael Schumacher, and then both Ferraris. In the race, David Coulthard actually came into the pit a couple of laps after his teammate Jacques Villeneuve. This means that after Coulthard pitted, he took the race lead from Villeneuve. Then our drivers came in for their only pit stop, and Berger, who pitted a lap later, jumped his teammate for 3rd place. And that was how the race ended. David Coulthard won the Italian Grand Prix with Villeneuve 2nd, Berger 3rd, Alesi 4th, and finally both Benettons of Collard and Genet, with Genet losing out this time. Reassuringly for Jordan, we weren't too far behind McLaren that race, and we were actually the 2nd quickest team, which is the very lowest we should be given the team we've got, but it is the first time in a while that we have been the 2nd quickest team. Jacques Villeneuve has now officially won the 2000 Formula 1 Drivers' Championship with 2 races to spare. He currently has 85 points, which is 26 more than David Coulthard, and is close to double the amount of points Jean Alesi has, who is 3rd in the championship. Marc Genet has the exact same number of points as his teammate Collard, despite competing in far fewer races. Gerhard Berger is in 6th, but is being caught up by Michael Schumacher, who, despite driving for Sauber, has still scored 23 points with 2 races to go. In the Constructors' Championship, McLaren have officially won with 144 points, which is 59 more than Benetton in 2nd. So the second to last round of the season, the Portuguese Grand Prix around Estoril, and Benetton took the front row, and they were 1.7 seconds ahead of the McLarens around such a small circuit. Ferrari locked out the 3rd row, Jordan the 4th, and amazingly Mark Goossens qualified in 9th in the worst car on the grid, and his teammate Oliver Gavin took 11th as well. I have no idea how Pacific did so well here, but their 2 low quality drivers will start the race either side of Michael Schumacher, which is quite some achievement. On the run down to the first corner, Oko Katayama overtook Jacques Villeneuve for 4th place. On lap 12, David Coulthard pitted from 3rd place and lost positions later on down the line by pitting so early. And that's it for the entire Grand Prix, which ended with another Benetton 1-2 led by Marc Genet. And that's Marc Genet's 4th race win all season. Katayama finally put Ferrari back on the podium with a 3rd place finish, which he gained purely through a good start and overtake on Villeneuve on the first lap. Villeneuve took 4th, Barrichello 5th, and Jean Alesi for Jordan took the final points position thanks to DC's early first pit stop. Now before I head into the final race of the season, I should point out this nightmare situation I have with my drivers for next year. So I wanted to get back Martin Brundle, partly because this is probably the only game I will play where he is a driver in it, partly because he was great when he drove for the team in 1996, and partly because he's Martin Brundle, why wouldn't I want him? But Mercedes still stipulates that I have to have a German in the team to get their engines. So I had to get a German now, or else Mercedes wouldn't supply Jordan next year. but I still wanted Brundle. But Brundle is currently not employed by any F1 team, so I had to sign him immediately or not at all, which causes me issues for next year unless I had Brundle replace Berger, but I don't want to do that because firstly I'd have to buy off Berger's contract or the remainder of it, and also I want Berger to actually compete in his final race for the team and not to just be cut short early. So yeah, that is the nightmare situation I have. So what I did, or I should say what will happen at the start of next season, is the game is going to give me a temporary driver for the start of next season, which I'll get into in the next episode. But for this season, for this episode, what I should say is, to get Mercedes engines next year, I needed a German and I needed them now. So I had to end one of my driver's contracts early, and Deniz drew the short straw there. So then I signed Jörg Müller. With Deniz out of the way, I signed Jörg Müller, who was the cheapest German I could get immediately. Then I signed a deal with Mercedes because Mercedes were happy now we had a German. So then I paid off Müller's contract to get rid of him because I didn't want him. And then I signed a driver who I actually wanted, which is Martin Brundle. And because he was an unemployed driver, as I already said, I had to get him immediately or not at all. Hence why he filled in the now vacant test driver role, which was previously held by Deniz, then Müller, and now Brundle. And I think that ends this annoying driver situation. So, long and short of it, Berger's going to be with the team for this one race, and then that's it. Alesi will be with us next season. Brundle will also be with us next season, but because Brundle's a test driver, and without putting Brundle in as a race driver, without doing that, the game's going to think I don't have two race drivers, even though I do, because one of them's a test driver. The game's going to give me a temporary driver, but as I said, I'll get into that in the next episode. Finally then, it's the last round of the season, the Japanese Grand Prix around Suzuka, and the qualifying results read like this. Genet took pole position, then it's Coulthard, Collard, Villeneuve, and both Ferraris led by Barrichello. Jean Alesi took 7th with Johnny Herbert and Bouillon separating Alesi from his outgoing teammate Gerhard Berger. During the race it started raining and Alesi was the first of our drivers to come into the pits. I just brought him in as soon as I could, but plainly though, I brought him in at exactly the right time because he ended up moving up to 3rd place once everyone else had fitted on the wet tyres. On lap 47, Oko Katayama retired, which meant he donated his 6th place to Gerhard Berger. At the very end of the race, Villeneuve pitted, which gave 2nd place to Alesi, or at least that's how it appeared. Yeah, as it turned out, Villeneuve finished in 2nd, despite plainly being in 3rd when the race ended. Just further evidence of how lucky Villeneuve has been over the past 2 seasons. Anyway, Marc Genet won the final race of the 2000 Formula 1 season with Jacques Villeneuve in 2nd and Jean Alesi in 3rd. Coulthard finished in 4th, Collard in 5th, and Berger took 6th after Oko Katayama retired due to, guess what, him spinning off circuit. So then, that's the end of the season, and let's take a look at the Drivers' Championship. As we already know, Jacques Villeneuve is the 2000 Formula 1 Drivers' Champion, and he took the title by 32 points over his teammate David Coulthard in 2nd. Marc Genet only competed in half the races this season, yet he still took 3rd in the championship with 53 points. That means you could logically say that Genet would have won the championship had he competed for the whole season, but he did also happen to come in just after Benetton returned to the very top pace-wise. A potentially more accurate way of looking at it would be if you added Genet's 53 points to Häkkönen's 19, which would make a total of 72. That's 10 more than David Coulthard, but that's still 22 less than what Villeneuve accrued. Alesi and Collard did well to get more than 40 points, and then it's Gerhard Berger down in 6th at the end of his final season with Jordan. Michael Schumacher wrung out all he could from his Sauber to finish in 7th with 23 points, which is 14 more than his teammate who didn't win a race this season, unlike Michael. Katayama scored twice as many points as his teammate Barrichello, Johnny Herbert though is the standout driver this season as he scored 4 whole points in a Simtech. The best Ford engine or not, that is still one heck of an achievement. The same could be said for Lagorce and Bart, who both got a point apiece for 40. How they did that in their dog of a car I will never know. And Williams rounded off their woeful season with 3 points scored by Bouillon and a lowly 1 single solitary point from Ralf Schumacher. On to the Constructors' Championship now, and McLaren won with 156 points, which is far less than the points total they amassed last season. Benetton took second thanks to their electric pace in the second half of the season, leaving ourselves at Jordan to take third, but that's still an improvement on where we finished last season with Nissan engines. Sauber had an amazing season by their standards and their best ever over the course of this series as they took 4th in the championship with Hill and Schumacher behind the wheel. That shows just how important drivers are to a team's fortunes, and the same can be said for Ferrari in 5th and Williams in joint 6th, who both underperformed this season, although at least Ferrari can blame it on their lack of engine improvement and not just on their drivers. Simtech are the other team that has 4 points and the same amount as the once championship winning Williams team. But Simtech really do have to thank Ford for giving them a much better engine than they had previously. And they also have to thank Johnny Herbert, who carried the team and excelled himself to get Simtech level pegging with Williams. And both teams used exactly the same engines this season. 40 staggeringly found real pace in qualifying as well as in the race at a couple of venues this season, and that allowed their drivers to score a point apiece. So 40, who would have had money on this, ended the 2000 season with 2 points, which is 2 more than both Minardi and Pacific, although it's clear which one of those 2 non-point scoring teams was the better, and I'll give you a clue. It's the one with which Irvine nearly got points for. So then, that's everything for the 2000 season, and in the next episode, I'll get onto the 2001 season, which I think will be the final season I will cover in this career mode. There's a fair few driver transfers that have happened between 2000 and 2001, some of which you would not predict in a million years. So, I'll leave you with that to ponder over, and I'll see you guys in the next episode in which I'll be covering the 2001 Formula 1 season.